Let's begin, as we have been all semester, with our guiding questions for the lecture. The first is, how were conditions for African Americans in early Ohio? And secondly, this second theme we're reiterating is the roles that Ohio played in the abolitionist movement. The chart on this slide shows total population growth in Ohio during the 19th century. As you can see, every decade in the century posted at least double-digit growth after that initial burst of population after statehood. This chart depicts the growth of the African American population in Ohio in the 19th century. Note that the growth relative to the white population was very slow. Yet even the presence of a few thousand black residents was threatening to many white Ohioans. Some of this, of course, was more social in nature, taking the form of the racism that developed in the 18th century in the United States that became firmly entrenched in Ohio. Some white Ohioans, though, opposed growth in the free black population in Ohio from an economic perspective, arguing that black workers would compete with whites for jobs, which would also drive down wages for all workers. In this video lecture, again, we're examining two intertwining themes. First, the experiences of African Americans in antebellum Ohio, and also the history of abolitionism in Ohio. Now, Ohio was a free state that had outlawed slavery, but it had a very complicated and lengthy history of racism. At the same time, though, some of the most famous abolitionists operated out of Ohio. As we discussed right before break, it's important to view abolitionism as a range of views on ending slavery. Some leaders were less interested in equal rights for all people. Some abolitionists actually despised African Americans and sought to end slavery by forcing American blacks to leave the United States. So on this spectrum, to the left, you have the more conservative or traditionalist views, ranging from colonization and gradualism, or the idea that slavery should be ended gradually and that there should be a process by which enslaved persons were freed, toward the more radical and even revolutionary abolitionists like John Brown, who advocated violence to overthrow the system. African Americans in Ohio were in a status I'm going to refer to in this lecture and throughout the course as free but unfree. Slavery was indeed outlawed under the state constitution. However, blacks did not have the right to vote, and they could not serve on juries. They could not testify against whites in court cases, and they were banned from state militias. Segregated education was the norm in many Ohio cities in the 19th century. In addition, there were high tensions between poor whites and free African Americans in the state. Poor whites feared that African Americans would take the few available jobs that there were existing for unskilled workers. Finally, black Ohioans at times endured and suffered terror attacks at the hands of white mobs. Ohio's state legislature wasted little time after statehood in enacting legislation collectively known as the Black Laws, two particular sets, 1804 and 1807. Migrant blacks moving to Ohio had to post a $500 bond upon entry to the state. The bond was supposedly to ensure, quote, good behavior and a proof of financial means. Since few, if any, blacks had that kind of money, they were forced to pay white bondsmen to cover the bonded amount, and these bondsmen frequently placed many restrictions on the lives of black Ohioans. This would be a bond not dissimilar to the sort of bond that would be in place if a person was released on bail and had to pay a bondsman to cover that bail. African Americans and biracial people had to get certificates of freedom from a court before settling in Ohio, and they had to prove their status when demanded by authorities. All black residents of the state of Ohio had to register with the names of their children. This registration fee in 1807 was 12.5 cents per name, which doesn't sound like much, but then again, you're looking at inflation that has happened since then. It would probably amount to an average of about $20 or $30 for a family of four. Significant, especially if you're lower income. It became a crime to employ a black person who did not possess a certificate of freedom. Anyone harboring or helping fugitive slaves was fined $1,000, and as an incentive, the informer received half of that fine. The black laws banned African Americans from testifying in court when whites were involved. These laws, as I've outlined here, were difficult to enforce for a number of reasons. First, there was no way to verify court and bond documents, and this is a time period in which forgery was easier to pull off than it is in the 21st century. In some places, these laws were ignored. In others, they were sort of selectively enforced. And many cities in the time period, this is before the professionalization of police departments, lacked law enforcement for this job. And then again, in some parts of the state, particularly in the northern part of the state, especially the Western Reserve, the Connecticut Western Reserve, whites in those areas at times refused to comply with the law. Early efforts at abolitionism tended to focus on the forced migration of African Americans back to Africa. And the first Ohio abolitionists were colonizationists. The American Colonization Society, which was formed in 1817, was a group that argued for what they called repatriation back to Africa, and it was very strong in the state of Ohio. Liberia began as a U.S. supported colony after freed blacks were shipped to West Africa. By 1867, colonizationists had relocated over 13,000 black Americans to Liberia, and Cincinnati was one of the largest chapters with over 200 dues-paying members by 1825. Similarly, the founders of the Ohio Colonization Society argued that Ohio was being flooded, in their words, with blacks from the South. A 1822 Ohio Colonization Society publication illustrates this mindset. Quote, "In the event of a slave war, it would not be in the slave-holding states and among slaves that those schemes of blood and ruin would be carried out, but here, where they enjoy enough of their freedom to feel their chains and to encourage them to break their chains. Here, where they are not under the watchful eye of a master. They already swarm our land like locusts." The publication created fear tactics to try to get support. There are, of course, a number of problems with these colonization schemes. In terms of financing, donations were far less than transport costs. Then there was the issue that most African Americans did not want to go. They were much more American than African, and some had ancestors who'd been in North America for centuries. Then finally, the sheer scale of the problem, of the idea of moving, perhaps in 1830, 3 million Americans from North America to West Africa and creating colonies is mind-bogglingly large. So this approach wasn't very practical. I'd like to briefly profile two early Ohio abolitionists. Benjamin Lundy was a Quaker abolitionist who moved to Ohio in 1814. He formed the first abolitionist society west of the Appalachians. He was also well known for the influential newspaper called the Genius of Universal Emancipation that he published 1821 to 1839. Originally, it was based in or nearby, rather, present-day Steubenville in eastern Ohio. It moved a number of times, usually because of local opposition to the things that were being printed. Lundy held very strong anti-slavery views, but he did support African repatriation schemes, the colonization scheme. He was also noteworthy because at one point he hired, at a young age, the very noteworthy abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison as an editor of his newspaper. Here is a scanned copy of The Genius of Universal Emancipation from 1830. This edition was printed when Lundy and Garrison were both working on the paper together. It was around this time that Garrison's views became more radical, and by 1833 the two men had severed their working relationship. Charles Osborne is another example of an early Ohio abolitionist. He too was a Quaker, originally from North Carolina. First he moved to Tennessee, but he not surprisingly found little support for abolitionism there, being as how it was a slave state. As a journalist, Osborne was an outspoken opponent of slavery. He moved to Mount Pleasant, Ohio in 1816 and began publishing The Philanthropist, which was the first anti-slavery newspaper in the United States. Osborne called for an immediate end to slavery without repatriation to Africa, so he was one of the earliest of the radical abolitionists. Let's switch gears a bit and examine the 1829 Cincinnati riots. This was a period of extreme violence led by white mobs against African Americans in Cincinnati. Local leaders proved completely unable to control angry white mobs during this period. Let's first look at some of the demographic changes that had been happening in Cincinnati in the 1820s. The population of African Americans in 1829 rose to about 9.4% of the city's population, up from 3.9% in 1820. In that decade, there were about 1,800 new black residents in Cincinnati. Similarly, the population of Irish Americans grew from 1.4% of the population to 4.7% of the population in the decade of the 1920s. And consequently, Irish and black Ohioans competed for the same low-wage jobs in cities like Cincinnati. The quote on this slide is from the editor of Liberty Hall, a Cincinnati newspaper. This reasoning used here was typical of white leaders in Cincinnati at the time. The quote reads, "The rapid increase of our black population, to say nothing of slavery, is of itself a great evil. This city is filled with night walkers, lewd persons, and those who lounge about without any visible means of support, especially the Negro house gamblers." So, looking at this quote, even white elites were disinclined to support the rights and freedoms of black residents of Cincinnati in the decade of the 1820s. Let's step back and examine the numerous causes of the 1829 Cincinnati riots. African American and Irish workers competed for the same jobs, and this led to economic conflict. White artisans worried about the decline of trades in an era of an increasing shift to wage labor in manufacturing settings, as opposed to traditional artisan skills for things like shoemaking or blacksmithing. The Cincinnati City Council had ignored petitions from white citizens about black tenement buildings that they believed were unsafe. While these petitions, of course, were racist in nature and not public safety oriented, because there were frankly just as many white tenement buildings, the city council's lack of action angered working class whites. In the first and third wards of the city, the political wards, petitions had been circulated, and they announced that no one would get electoral support who did not agree to end the growth of the African American population of Cincinnati. But I should point out that many councilmen, business owners, and rich elites profited from cheap black labor. Thus, while they might have held similar negative views about blacks, at the same time they were unwilling to drive these people out of town because they were a cheap source of labor. As a compromise to white workers, the city forced African Americans to register, present certificates of freedom, and roll the name of a bondsman, or they would be forced to leave the city altogether. This is a restarting of the 1807 black laws. Cincinnati's blacks were given just 30 days to comply. African Americans attempted to buy some time to relocate their communities to Canada. They had asked for 3 months, but the white leaders of the city held firm at 30 days. Unfortunately, working class whites refused to honor the 30-day bargain, and within 10 days or so of the bargain being reached, white mobs began armed raids into black neighborhoods, trying to drive them out of the city. Black houses were burned and demolished. Up to 1,500 black residents of the city of Cincinnati were driven outside of the city limits. The city fined several white mob leaders, but there were few arrests of whites. Most of the arrested actually were African Americans, supposedly for their own protection. Cincinnatians and the Ohio legislature were in agreement that there would be no governmental funding set aside to aid black Cincinnati residents who moved to a community they founded in Canada called Wilberforce, named after the famed abolitionist, British abolitionist William Wilberforce. Finally, the religious group, the Quakers, donated some money for blacks to purchase land in Canada. The riots, though, should be viewed within the context of a lengthy legacy of strained race relations in the city of Cincinnati. There would continue to be smaller flare-ups like this in Cincinnati for the rest of the 19th century. So we will wind up this brief overview of Abolitionist Era Ohio around the year 1830. While there were a few abolitionists present in the state during this time period, their influence was quite limited, and many were pushing these back to Africa colonizationist schemes that in reality could not solve the issues facing over 3 million black Americans who lived in the United States in that year, free and enslaved. This draws to a close the first half of our look at Abolitionist Era Ohio. We'll see you on the next video.